This is a tale of two cities, a tale of war on land and sea, a long, bitter feud fought between two of the most enlightened, civilized, and progressive states in the ancient world. They fought in a nasty, bestial, and vicious way. It is not a pretty tale. 455 years before the birth of Christ, there were two great powers in ancient Greece, then the center of the known world. Today, in more peaceful times, the sleepy remnants of this great conflict are admired by tourists, many unaware of their magnificent past. These two mighty Hellenic powers were Athens and Sparta. Both were proud city-states who eyed each other with great suspicion. Each was certain that it should wield supreme authority. But as we all know, there can only be one leader. It is said that he who ignores the past is doomed to repeat its mistakes. How true in this case. Both Athens and Sparta knew the war would result in the destruction and humiliation of one of them. But which was it to be? They had fought before many times, but a treaty drawn up in 455 BC had kept the peace. Rather like the great powers of Europe in the build-up to World War I, the long peace was seen as the pause before war. For 20 years, both Athens and Sparta built up a complex series of alliances to bolster their own chances in the event of war. Like the events of 1914, ironically, it was the complex system of alliances which was to actually precipitate the fighting. The fragile peace crumbled when Athens offered military assistance to one of her allies. This was a clear breach of the treaty, and the Spartan response was to issue a terse ultimatum. Athens returned an uncompromising reply. The Spartans felt that there was only one course of action for them to pursue: war. Both Athenians and Spartans were fearful of the economic advantages that would accrue to the victor in a war between them. Despite the possible consequences for the civilian population, the people of both Sparta and Athens were pro-war. We are lucky that some of the speeches of the day have been preserved. This jealous rivalry had spurred the popular pro-war party. The hatred of her rival lay only just below the surface in both cities, even in peacetime. So it was no surprise that the impassioned speeches from both camps were soon heard in a renewed effort to galvanize the people into war. Again, the parallels with the Great War are not lost. Peace had lasted too long. People wanted war. The politicians were only too happy to give it to them. Let us not have any talk about thinking twice. It is the wrongdoers and not the wronged who should think twice. You must vote now, and like true Spartans, vote for war. Don't let Athens grow greater still. Don't abandon our allies. With God on our side, let us attack. So pleaded the Spartan politician, Sthenelaios. Fiery oratory like this helped win the case against the peaceful counsels of King Archidamus. The great showdown was not far away. But it was not just the Spartans who sought the final reckoning. In Athens, Pericles, who ruled there as an autocrat in all but name, spoke in equally warlike terms. We must realize that this war is being forced upon us, and the more readily we accept the challenge, the less eager our opponents will be to attack us. We must resist our enemies in every way and try to leave those who come after us an Athens that is as great as ever. Change the word Athens for Germany, and we could easily hear the words of Kaiser Wilhelm or Hitler in our own century.
Well, 435 years before Christ in Greek history is a dark hour. Oh, it was the start of what is called the Peloponnesian Wars. I mean, awful. The most awful wars of all time. I mean, terribly tragic, terribly sad. It all started stupidly. It was all about commerce. Athens had become very, very rich. They'd always, in actual fact, since Solon had brought in democracy, they had brought in lots of artists and carpenters and tradesmen from other countries, and it all blossomed in Athens. Athens had become this wonderful, artistic, brilliant state. Sparta had been very, very jealous of Athens, now wanted war with Athens.
Sparta represents oligarchy, ruled by a few people. Athens represents democracy, ruled by decision of the majority. Sparta represents fighting on land. Athens represents fighting at sea. Sparta represents supposedly allies who have a right to a say in the decision-making processes of the Spartan League, though in fact they very rarely got such a say. The Athenians represent empire and domination.
With the arrival of the long-awaited war, both sides prepared with gusto. In recent times, Athens had been growing in power and influence. In so doing, she had infringed the rights and liberties of many small states. It was Sparta which won the hearts and minds of the neutral states. The Greek historian Thucydides wrote at length of the build-up to the war. Nothing in their designs was on a small or mean scale. Both sides put everything into their war effort. In other states, people's feelings were very much on the side of the Spartans. They had proclaimed that their aim was the liberation of Hellas, and so bitter was the general feeling against Athens, both from those who wished to escape from her rule, or from those who feared that they would come under it. The Athenian and Spartan forces on land were pretty evenly matched at the outbreak of hostilities, but the Spartans would always have the edge, thanks to their special military regime. From there, Spartan has earned its own place in the English language.
Sparta, a place which regularly expelled foreigners, which relied only on the rich, and which kept the majority of its population under fairly severe subjection, that discouraged freedom of speech and was noted for its austerity, its lack of luxury, and its continual focus on military training. Athens, according to Pericles, was a great military success, but this was achieved by love of its freedom, love of its people, rather than through force of military habit.
Although the Spartans, by their superior training and discipline, undoubtedly had a major advantage on land, on the high seas, it was a different matter. Athens was then acknowledged to be the greatest sea power in the world. The Athenian fleet, however, consisted of over 300 seaworthy galleys. No other state could match such power. The world of the Athenian navy was a strange one. The popular conception of the ancient triremes is that, like the galleys of Rome, they were crewed by slaves. In fact, they were rowed entirely by free men who were paid to do the work. Although conditions were far from pleasant, the triremes of Athens and Sparta were not ocean-going vessels. They put into port every night so the men could get ashore. These were not the downtrodden slaves of Rome, but willing, able, and patriotic professional sailors.
Triremes were the most important type of Greek warship. They were made of wood, were approximately 100 feet long and 15 feet wide, and they were propelled by 170 rowers. The full crew complement was about 200. They were equipped with a ram in the prow of the ship, and the idea was to ram and disable or to sink the opposing ships. The Athenians had at their height between 300 and 400 of these ships, and they were basically what made the Athenians into a superpower.
Conditions on board ship were basically pretty wretched. The Athenian fighting vessel was one in which you had to pack as many men, because it's the men who give the power, as many men as possible into as small a space as possible, because a small space is much easier to control. And the way in which the Athenians packed themselves into the ships was they had one row on top of another, basically 3 rows of rowers, all rowing like mad in order to ensure that they drove the ship. As you can imagine, large numbers of men in very, very cramped conditions are not comfortable.
Despite the superiority of the Athenian navy, the Spartans knew that the war was ultimately won or lost on land. In due course, they would meet Athens at sea, but in June 431 BC, preparations were complete and the Spartan army invaded Attica, the heartland of the Athenian state. But the Athenians had anticipated just such a move. They had withdrawn all their possessions from the countryside and ensconced themselves within the walls of Athens itself, so that the raid proved fruitless. The first major engagement of the war, a small, indecisive cavalry battle, took place on the dusty plain outside Athens, but it was inconclusive. The Spartans laid waste to the land and finally departed. The first phase of the war was over. Both cities still lived. Athens retaliated for the invasion of her soil in the most natural way for her. She used her fleet to mount an attack on the island of Aegina and made several violent incursions into Spartan territory. The Spartans, a land-based power, could not meet a serious challenge to her men. If the Spartans were to be victorious, they would ultimately need to match the Athenians' naval expertise, particularly in the use of the famous Greek galleys. Now the strength of the Athenian navy was unleashed. Communities all around the Peloponnesian coast were soon made to feel the wrath of the Athenians, as a fleet of 100 galleys set out loaded with soldiers. They carried out raids, burning crops and buildings, and spreading terror wherever they landed. Pericles himself was in charge of this last campaign. Given the Spartan superiority on land, his chosen tactic was a wise one. Pericles avoided pitched battles in favor of a hit-and-run naval war. First blood to Athens. In 429 BC, the Spartans changed their offensive tactics and laid siege to Athens' ally, Plataea. Like those of Athens, the walls of Plataea held the Spartans at bay. In a chilling precursor to what was to become the fate of Athens, the protracted siege was turned into a full blockade. The inhabitants of Plataea would grow to curse their walls. So that not even a mouse could escape, the Spartans built a wall completely around the city and waited for the inhabitants to starve or surrender. With the great distance in time which separates us from the classical world, these events seem remote and clinical. Those of us who are fortunate to live in peaceful times cannot really comprehend what it actually meant to be in a city under siege. But pain and suffering transcend the ages. As food ran low, the inhabitants would be forced to eat rats and boil the leather from their shoes. Malnutrition, disease, and starvation stalked the streets. This pain and suffering was as real as the news reports from war zones on our television screens. For them, the reality was violent, bitter, and heartrending. Mothers watched weak children die.
The realities of the siege for the besieged were, as the realities of naval warfare for those who take part in it, extremely wretched. In effect, you were cooped up into a small place because there were no Greek cities which had enormous fortified areas. You were cooped up into a small place where you couldn't grow your own food, and of course your opponents were ensuring that you didn't get food from your surrounding territory. So it's a matter of starvation. What happens in a siege is that there is an attempt at grinding the people down. It was unlikely that they would be given relief because armies would be unlikely to come and be able to assist them. So all they had to look forward to was surrender, capture, and possibly afterwards execution.
The wall which the Spartans erected around Plataea was in fact 2 wooden walls 16 feet apart. The central alley in between was covered in huts, occupied by the besiegers. Tall lookout towers at regular intervals kept the same silent vigil as the towers at a concentration camp. They too looked on great human suffering. From behind the wooden stranglehold, the Spartans sallied in to attack. Plataea's wooden fortifications held them at bay. But for how long?
The Spartans then decided to build a mound against the city walls so that they could go over the top of the city walls. The Plataean defenders tried to counter this by 2 mechanisms. First, they built up their own city walls on the side that it was being threatened by the mound. And secondly, they dug underneath and into the side of the mound from the city side of the walls in order that it might collapse. The Spartans having successfully stopped the Spartans in this way, the Spartans tried another tactic, which was to bring up siege weapons. Now, these in effect would merely have been battering rams that perhaps had a covering. But the Plataeans managed to stop these by attaching logs to frames that were hung out from the city walls and then swinging the logs down so that they broke off the end of the battering rams. So the Spartans once again have been stopped, and they try a third and final active tactic, which is fire. They cover wood with sulfur and pitch and put it against the sides of the Plataean city walls and throw it inside the Plataean town and set light to it. This probably would have been successful as a tactic had the wind not failed to pick up, and in addition to this, it's possible there's a rainstorm that helped put out the fire.
Athens had promised relief for the Plataeans, but they lacked the decisive leadership which Pericles had given them. Help from Athens never materialized. Finally, it was the summer of 427 that the stricken city of Plataea was finally forced to surrender. When they did, the beleaguered defenders probably wished they hadn't. The horrors of the siege were as nothing compared to what was to follow. The women were taken as slaves, and every single one of the men was put to death. The city was later razed to the ground. If things were going badly for Athens and her allies on land and sea, the Athenian navy was still proving just how effective it could be. In a sea battle in the Gulf of Patrae, the 20 Athenian ships were faced with a Peloponnesian fleet of 47 ships. But even there, these odds held no fear for the Athenians. Thucydides, a chronicler who witnessed the events, takes up the story. The Spartans sailed with their ships in circular formation, the prows facing outwards and the sterns in. The circle was as big as could be, without leaving gaps wide enough for the enemy to maneuver in. And inside the circle were all the light craft that formed part of the expedition, together with 5 of the fastest and best equipped warships, which were to be constantly ready to sail outside and come to the relief of any portion of the circumference where the enemy might attack. The Athenians formed a line and sailed in an ever-decreasing circle around the enemy ships, forcing them to bunch together and become mixed up with their smaller boats. And when the wind rose at dawn, the Spartans were in utter confusion. Thucydides tells what happened next. Ships fell foul of each other and had to be pushed off with poles. What with shouting and swearing and the yells from one ship to another, it was impossible to hear what the captains wanted done, or the orders given by the boatswains. Lacking experience as they did, they could not clear their oars in the rough sea, and so made the ships more difficult for the steersmen to handle. It was at this moment that Phormio gave the signal. The Athenians attacked. They destroyed every craft they encountered, and without resisting in any way, the rest of the Spartan ships fled. Despite the successes at sea, the Athenians could not dictate the course of the land war. The fighting ebbed and flowed on, with neither side remotely close to total victory. But in 424 BC, the tide began to turn when a major defeat was inflicted on the Athenians at Delium. Delium was the site of a temple of Apollo. The Athenian general and philosopher Hippocrates was commander of the Athenian forces. He was to prove a better philosopher than a soldier. Within one day of leaving Athens, the nervous Hippocrates had reached Delium, and without delay, he set about building fortifications. As soon as he had secured the garrison, he left a small contingent of 300 cavalry as defenders and began a hasty march back to Athens. On a field about 1 mile east of Delium, he encountered an army, Sparta's allies, the Boeotians. The Boeotians had only one thing in their minds. That was to avenge the desecration of their temple. They were ready to strike immediately. Forces from all over the territory arrived to participate in the battle and gathered behind a hill that separated the two armies. Late in the afternoon, once the Boeotians had set up their battle formation, they appeared at the crest of the hill. The cavalry were positioned at each wing with the light troops. Between them were 3,000 Theban warriors, massed 25 shields deep. Here were the most able-bodied, disciplined, and dangerous warriors to be found in the ancient world. Hippocrates had formed his hoplite soldiers in a line 8 men deep and posted his cavalry units on their flanks. Just before they engaged the enemy, Hippocrates addressed his men. If we are victorious, the Spartans, without the support of the Boeotian cavalry, will never again invade our land. And in one battle, you will both gain this country and do much to free your own. Go forward then to meet them in the spirit of the citizens of a city which we are all proud to call the first in Greece. The Boeotians paused to sing their war songs. Then the two armies advanced and joined in fierce combat. But it was to prove a disaster for the Athenians. The doom of a great city was one step closer.
The Battle of Delium was the one big land defeat that Athens suffered in the first half of the Peloponnesian War. It was part of a grand scheme of the Athenians to capture and occupy the territory of their western neighbour, Boeotia. And the idea was that there would be a three-pronged attack, all happening on the same day, coming from the west, from the south, and from the northeast, which is where Delium was. Unfortunately, the plan was betrayed to the Boeotians, and the timing went wrong, so that the southern and western attacks were dealt with before the Athenians reached Delium, and the Boeotians could turn their entire attention to the Athenian army there. Seeing that things had gone wrong, the Athenians were actually on the point of retreating, and they'd lost quite a lot of their light-armed troops who'd returned home, and were left only with the main hoplite body, the main heavily armoured infantry. And this was up against a Theban force of about the same size. But the Thebans, the Boeotians, were people who had developed some quite novel tactics for heavy armed fighting, and they were able to defeat the Athenians basically by packing one side of their army and forcing their way through the Athenian defenders, and the Athenians turned and ran.
Hippocrates himself was left on the field of Delium, along with 1,000 of Athens' precious hoplite warriors. The loss of manpower was a serious blow to Athens. Added to this was the increasing financial cost of the war.
The problem, though, was the rate at which the Athenians were spending money. This was because of two problems. First of all, it was quite expensive to man and equip a fleet. To keep a ship afloat for a month cost approximately a talent. The Athenians in any one year might be sending out 100 ships for at least 3 or 4 months. So this was a considerable drain. Even worse, siege operations were particularly expensive. The siege of Potidæa at the beginning of the war cost the Athenians no less than 2,000 talents to besiege one reasonably small town. This meant that as early as 427 BC, the Athenians had to levy an emergency war tax of 200 talents on their own population. Given this strain on resources, if the Spartans could ever find out a way of encouraging revolt among Athens' allies and stopping imperial contributions, Athens would be in very serious difficulty.
The tide of war inevitably began to turn against Athens, but the great city was not yet finished. In 426, an Athenian named Demosthenes finds his way into the contemporary reports. A soldier of bold initiative, his actions saved Athens on many occasions. And there was still the valiant Athenian navy, which exercised superiority at sea. In an attempt to foil the Athenian strength at sea, the Spartans were attempting to gain dominance of the naval bases at the mouth of the Corinthian Gulf. Having been foiled by Demosthenes at Naupactus, they tried their luck at Olpae, but together with their Ambraciot allies, were once again repulsed by Demosthenes' innovative battle tactics. Here at last was an Athenian general who could bring victory on land. But Demosthenes was not only vicious on the battlefield. At the negotiating table, he was equally efficient. In the wake of the battle, the defeated Spartans bought their lives by a mean trick, typical of the depths to which this war had now sunk. A secret pact between Spartans and Athenians brought the Spartans leave to flee the field, but it left the Ambraciots to the mercy of the victors. The Spartans slunk away, and the hapless Ambraciots were slaughtered on the spot. 425 BC saw Demosthenes once again prove his worth. On his way to Sicily, he was driven by inclement weather into the harbor of Pylos off the Peloponnesian coast. Demosthenes lost no time in making advantage out of mishap, and at once started building defenses. The Spartans, alarmed at the arrival of the Athenian forces so close to them, ordered both army and fleet to the peninsula.
The Athenians made a landing there and were able to attract any disaffected Spartans, of whom there were very many because of the Spartan social system, any disaffected Spartans to join the Athenians in their settlement, in their fortification at Pylos and Sphacteria. There were further advantages in that the Athenians, when they won the campaign at Sphacteria, were able to capture large numbers of Spartan citizen soldiers. And since there were so few Spartan citizen soldiers, the Athenians were able to use those soldiers as hostages.
By 421 BC, following 10 years of indecisive warfare in what historians call the Archidamian War, both sides began to feel that it was time to make peace. A treaty was drawn up and agreed to by both sides. No doubt, people on all sides breathed a sigh of relief and agreed with the words that the Greek dramatist Aristophanes, in one of his anti-war dramas, put into the mouth of his heroine Lysistrata. "Never again, pray God, shall we lose our way in such madness." But it was not to be. Before long, the build-up of a system of alliances began again. Athens concluded a defense pact with Argos in what became known as the Quadruple Alliance. When Sparta invaded Argos, she did so to defend one of her own allies. But Athens was now dragged into the war, and in the winter of 419-418 BC, the hostilities were renewed. This time, her luck would not hold. The Athenians had long dreamed of an Athenian empire in the west, and by 415 BC, a boost to morale was required to give new hope to the unsuccessful years of war, and the expansion to the west was an apposite temptation that excited the imagination. The obvious goal was Syracuse in Sicily, which the Athenians had long coveted, and to which they had dispatched unsuccessful expeditions in the past. With great enthusiasm, the Athenian assembly agreed to send out one of the largest expeditions they had ever produced. Thucydides takes up the story. Certainly this expedition that first set sail was by a long way the most costly and finest looking force of Hellenic troops that up to that time had come from a single city. In numbers of ships, it was no greater than the force which Pericles took to Epidaurus, 4,000 Athenian hoplites, 300 cavalry, and 100 triremes, with the addition of 50 more ships from Lesbos and Chios, and many allied troops as well. Every sailor received a drachma a day from the treasury, and the captains too went to great expense on the figureheads and fittings. To the rest of Hellas, it looked more like a demonstration of the power and greatness of Athens than an expeditionary force setting out against the enemy.
Almost every household in Athens had at its gate a plain column or pillar topped with a head, often said to be that of Hermes, hence the name Herm, and was provided with a set of male genitalia. During the night before the Athenian expedition was meant to sail, the phalli were knocked off from outside many of the houses, and since they were believed to give protection and fertility to the household, there was great distress. It was a very bad omen.
With a total personnel of some 30,000 men, this impressive fleet took to the open sea, first sailing in a column and then racing each other as far as Aegina. The fleet sailed firstly for the island of Corcyra and then on to southern Italy. The campaign at Syracuse was to extend over the following 2 years until, like the fighting in Greece, it degraded into a series of attacks and counterattacks which even Demosthenes could not swing in the favor of Athens. Then, in 413, the Athenians came tantalizingly close to success. A night attack brought them up to the plateau at Euryalus without mishap, where they managed to capture one of the Syracusan forts. But some of the defenders escaped to raise the alarm, and before long, a full-scale battle broke out on the plateau. The Athenians were driven back with appalling losses. As many as 2,000 of their men lay scattered over the plateau when the conflict was over.
The expedition against Syracuse was, some of the Athenians thought, ill-fated from the day it set sail. The vast majority of soldiers and seamen who went never returned. The memory of the night of the mutilation of the Herms must have stayed in the minds of the Athenians who had lost brothers and fathers and sons for many, many years.
There was no alternative but to re-embark and withdraw from the island. Nicias realized that this would be viewed as a death knell to Athenian prestige, and Aristophanes, in his drama The Knights, showed how highly the Athenians prized their reputation. Let us praise our mighty fathers, men who ne'er would quake or quail, worthy of their native city, worthy of Athene's vale, men who with our fleets and armies everywhere the victory ran, and adorned our ancient city with achievement nobly done. Nicias, however, bowed to the advice of his soothsayers when an eclipse of the moon darkened the night appointed for the escape. The time was inauspicious, they told him. The 3-week delay provided the Syracusans with time to prepare for the final annihilation of the Athenian army. Gylippus, the Spartan commander, prepared a grand assault on the Athenian navy. Thucydides relates what happened next. The Syracusans went out with a fleet of 76 sail. The Athenians put out to meet them with 86 ships, came to close quarters, and engaged. The Syracusans and their allies first defeated the Athenian center and then caught Eurymedon, the commander of the right wing, who was sailing out from the line more towards the land in order to surround the enemy in the hollow and recess of the harbor, and killed him and destroyed ships accompanying him. The Athenian attack suited the Syracusans in their heavier ships. They turned their vessels to meet the Athenians prow to prow, and the resulting collisions crushed and damaged many of the enemy ships. The small darters of the Syracusans rode among the Athenian triremes, breaking oar blades and shooting darts in through the oar holes at the rowers. After which, Thucydides informs us, they now chased the whole Athenian fleet before them and drove them ashore. The Athenians were forced into a long and treacherous march to try and escape their misery over land. But Gylippus had foreseen the possibility, and the Athenians were attacked at every step. In the confusion, Nicias and Demosthenes' armies were separated, and while Demosthenes was compelled finally to surrender, Nicias and his men marched into slaughter. Javelins and other missiles poured into the unfortunate men as they walked, and when they stopped to slake their desperate thirst at a river, they were surrounded by the Syracusans and their allies and butchered. The water was red with blood, and the Syracusans' revenge complete. Brave Demosthenes was taken and executed. This was the greatest Hellenistic achievement of any in this war, wrote Thucydides, or, in my opinion, any Hellenistic victory, at once most glorious to the victors and most calamitous to the conquered. Everything was destroyed, and few out of the many returned home.
40,000 Athenians dying, and 240 ships rotting, and then all the Athenians who've gone over to Sicily being imprisoned in the quarries of Syracuse. If you ever go to Sicily, go to the quarries at Syracuse. At night, you can hear the Athenians crying out, the ghosts of the Athenians. Awful! Awful! Mismanagement, greed, stupidity.
The news of the disaster in Syracuse was greeted in Athens, first with disbelief and then with despair. Some have argued that Thucydides is exaggerating the response to this disaster, but given that the Athenians had lost perhaps 40,000 men and between a half and two-thirds of their operational fleet, it's easy to believe that they fell into something approaching a state of panic. In addition to this difficulty of having lost a good deal of their fleet, which was a standing encouragement of many of the large islands of the Aegean to revolt, which they duly did. In addition to this problem, the Spartans had sent an army north to occupy the town of Decelea, which was within sight of Athens. This made Athenian agricultural production and silver mining much more difficult than it had been in the past. Thirdly, the Persians took this opportunity to pay the Athenians back for some interference in internal Persian affairs that the Athenians had been involved in. And so they began to finance Athens' enemies, the Spartans, to help them build a fleet.
The defeat at Syracuse was a turning point. Cities hitherto loyal to Athens sensed the waning power and defected to the Spartan cause, hoping to finally win freedom. Many considered that the war was now certain to be short-lived, and they would gain credit with Sparta without the risk of great loss. Euboea and Lesbos, Chios, Amphipolis, Erythraea, and Thasos deserted the Athenians, and the Lacedaemonians ended their neutrality in favor of the Spartans. But the war was still far from finished. As the net closed in on her, the great city-state still was prepared to fight to the death. There were still some hopes for success. Athens had rekindled her hopes of a victory at sea. That victory came in the narrow waters of the Hellespont, in a hand fight between 86 Spartan triremes who fought 76 belonging to the Athenians. The Spartans, under their commander Mindarus, sailed to the attack, attempting to outflank the Athenian galleys near the European shore. But Thrasyllus, the Athenian commander, spread his ships in a long line in a vain effort to thwart this maneuver. The Athenian was forced to weaken his center, a fact which was immediately spotted by the Spartan commander who led the attack. This attack was carried out with such success that the ships became confused. But when the Athenians had beaten off the attacks on their flanks, they were easily able to rally and see off the entire Peloponnesian squadron. Following this action, with another decisive victory near Cyzicus fought on land and at sea, the Athenians proved that they were not a spent force at sea. But time was still running out.
It may seem very strange that within 3 years of the Athenian defeat at Sicily, and only about 5 years before the final Athenian defeat, the Spartans actually tried to come to peace terms with the Athenians, and the Athenians rejected this. Happened after a successful Athenian victory at the Battle of Cyzicus. And I think the reason that they didn't accept the peace were two. First of all, from their perspective at that point, it didn't necessarily look as though defeat was staring them in the face. And secondly, there would have been a number of Athenian politicians for whom the idea of coming to peace with Sparta would mean their own political eclipse. They had made their success by hostility to Sparta, and for them, an Athenian victory over Sparta seemed both possible and preferable. So rather than being seen as an act of folly, this should be seen as a political calculation, a military calculation, but one that was ultimately the wrong one.
Despite her naval victories, events were inexorably against Athens. She could not expect her luck to hold forever. In the summer of 407 BC, Alcibiades was made commander-in-chief of all the Athenian forces. He was to be the last. His counterpart on the Spartan side was Lysander. It was he who was to finally bring about the downfall of Athens. Lysander was a rare breed among Spartans, an astute politician who won the confidence of the huge Persian Empire. He received generous subsidies, and as a result, he was able to build up the Spartan navy. Once the Athenians were destroyed in battle, it was only a matter of time. The stage was set for the decisive sea battle of the war. It took place in the straits at Aegospotami in 405 BC. Acting against wise advice to retire from battle, the Athenians tried to lure Lysander from Lampsacus and into combat, but he wanted to pick his moment. After several days, it appeared to the Athenians that there would be no battle. They became lax in their guard and allowed most of the crews to land. Lysander took the auspicious moment and attacked. The Athenians, completely surprised and unready for battle, were overrun and 160 of their galleys captured. The crews were rounded up and all of the Athenians among them mercilessly executed. Athenian supremacy at sea was over. The shock waves crashed through the city of Athens like an earthquake. Everyone knew what would happen next. As the great historian Xenophon recalled, on that night, not a man slept, not merely from sorrow, but from terror, for the future fate with which they themselves were now menaced, a retribution for what they themselves had inflicted on the Aeginetans, Melians, and others. The Athenian Empire disintegrated, and Athens was besieged by a vast Spartan force on land and at sea, cut off and alone. The people held out until they began to die of starvation, and by April 404 BC, Athens was forced to surrender. Lysander and the Peloponnesians now occupied the streets of the once great city. Athens was deprived of all but 12 galleys, lost all of its major land possessions. It was only through the intercession of Lysander that the great city itself was not destroyed and its inhabitants killed. But Athens was reduced to the status of a subject ally to Sparta under the terms of the surrender. The magnificent walls of that great city were not spared. They had preserved the Athenians safe against the aggressors for 100 years. But now they had to go.
The destruction of the long walls for Athens was, as it were, the destruction of the symbol of their very existence, because the Athenians had supported themselves by importing cereals from abroad, with their ability to control the sea. But now that their long walls were destroyed by the Spartans, they were unable to control the area between the Piraeus, their port, and the city itself. And so once the long walls were destroyed, they couldn't any longer import cereals for the feeding of the population, and so that was the end of the Athenian ability to support themselves.
Here in the Agora, what would now be a modern marketplace, it is easy to imagine the hustle and bustle of ancient times, and how the rumors and gossip must have reached fever pitch. Her increased wealth and status was reflected in the fabulous buildings erected during this prosperous period. We can see remains of these structures which still dominate the landscape of modern-day Athens today. The cost in lives and materials to Athens of the long wars with Sparta had been colossal. In the end, the goddess Athene seemed to have abandoned her people. It was under her protection that Athens had risen to glory. She was never again to experience the heady power of her former days. The glory of Athens was lost forever. On the hot, dusty plains of Asia Minor, a small band of Greek warriors was preparing to do battle against a huge Persian army. They were about to strike the first blows in a revolt against the oppressive, tyrannical rule of the Persians. By doing so, they had little idea they would embark on the most important and desperate series of battles in ancient history. It was to change forever the course of European history. The invincible Persian Empire would ultimately be brought to its knees in the first great ideological conflict fought between a brutal empire on the one hand and a freedom-loving democratic people on the other. This legend still endures today as the Persian Wars. The long drawn-out wars fought between the Persians and the Greeks actually began in Asia Minor, along the Mediterranean coast of what is now present-day Turkey.
I suppose one of the most interesting times in Greek history are the Persian Wars. Persia always looked on Greece with envious eyes. In 492 years before Christ, there was Persia, and there was the Cyclades in Asia Minor, and there was little Greece with all its states. Persia wanted it. It was almost east versus west, you might say, the war. And particularly Athens, which flourished now artistically, flourished as a maritime nation, had wonderful ships and gold and diamonds and everything it was just a marvelous state. And they wanted it. Persia wanted it and wanted to rule the waves.
The Greeks were a seafaring people, and over the years they established a number of colonies in Ionia. At first, these colonies enjoyed the protection of the Lydian Empire, which the Greeks were happy to accept. But with the fall of the Lydians, the overlords were replaced by the Persian Empire, a harsh and unforgiving master whose heavy-handed rule soon found disfavor with the Greeks, traditionally used to more enlightened government. Unlike the later Roman Empire, the Persian Empire was not a single unified state. It was more a confederation of states, all bound together by allegiance to the Persian king. All of them, including the Ionian Greeks, were obliged to supply the Persian king with troops, as well as taxes.
Persia was a huge force. You can even claim that there were something like 1 million men in various forms of troops being passed across. However, largely because of their mistakes, the Persians really lost the whole game. And as a result of that, of course, Athens and Sparta were another little countries which joined to assist in this great attempt against the enemy invasion, was in a position to defeat them in the end until they had to roll back to the eastern countries again.
In 500 BC, the Greeks finally revolted against Persian rule. Under the leadership of Aristagoras, they declared their independence and appealed for help from the European Greek states. The first state to respond was Athens, then the strongest and most important Greek state. The Athenians duly provided a large contingent of men and ships, and with their help, the rebels took the offensive, advancing from Ephesus to Sardis. The Athenians, fighting away from home, naturally grew reckless. With complete disregard for the consequences, they plundered and burned the Persian city of Sardis. This unexpected escalation led to the swift recall of the Athenian contingent. But even without their help, the revolt afterwards spread successfully all along the coast and south to the Greek colonies on the island of Cyprus. Continued Persian control was now in the balance. Naturally, the growing revolt was viewed with some alarm in the Persian capital, Susa. It was clearly getting out of hand. As the local forces were clearly unable to contain the outbreak, the Persian king Darius summoned the huge imperial contingents of Asia Minor and the Phoenician navy for a heavy counteroffensive. Faced with sudden, overwhelming odds, the Greeks' advance was quickly rolled back, and within 4 years, the revolt had been completely crushed. Now it was time for Darius to repay the Athenians. The disunity of the Greeks was to prove a major advantage. The Greek states were all fiercely independent of each other, so it was a relatively easy matter for Darius to exert pressure upon them one by one, and to demand a symbolic offering of earth and water in acknowledgement of Persian overlordship. But there were others who held out against the Persians. Inspired by the oratory of their leaders and their willingness to do battle, Athenians and Spartans refused all overlords. Soon they were the only Greek states of any stature still holding out against this diplomatic offensive. And in the spring of 490 BC, diplomacy turned to war. It was time, decided Darius, to demonstrate that he meant business. The enemy forces on the mainland of Greece were to be destroyed and their cities pillaged. It was to be a lesson for all time. Like those of today, international affairs are never clean and simple. It was just the same in the ancient world, as it was not difficult for the Persians to find an Athenian to introduce a subtle political element to the campaign. His name was Hippias, an exiled Athenian nobleman, and it was agreed that he would be installed as a client ruler once the Athenians were defeated. In return, he and his followers would sow discontentment and uncertainty in Athens. Methodically moving from island to island and securing control of the Aegean Sea, the Persians moved closer in. Naxos and Choristus were captured and sacked, and Eretria betrayed after a week-long siege. Now, Athens itself was threatened.
Persian army was certainly not just a ragbag. It has perhaps that reputation because a number of forces from far-flung parts of the Persian Empire were brought by Xerxes, perhaps just for symbolic reasons. But the main force in the Persian army was enormously well trained. They had, after all, conquered an empire pretty much the size of the Roman Empire in pretty much less than a century, and you can't do that with a ragbag army. The problem was that they were trained to fight on level ground, and level ground is something which Greece does not provide in large numbers. What the Persians would have to do in order to deploy their numbers effectively was to ensure that they could fight on level battlefields where they could use their cavalry and their extremely well-trained infantry in order to use the advantages of numbers which they enjoyed against the Greeks. What the Greeks had to do in return, of course, was to ensure that they fought only in narrow passes where the Persians would not be able to deploy those numerical advantages. And on the whole, it was the Greeks who won.
The treacherous Hippias recommended a landing in the nearby bay of Marathon. It was a good harbor, protected from the north and east winds. The sandy beach could easily accommodate the 600 ships of the Persian fleet, and immediately inland lay a broad, firm plain where the Persian cavalry could operate to advantage. A landing was duly effected without difficulty, as Athens lay some 38 kilometers to the northeast. But even as the Persians were coming ashore, alarm beacons warned the Athenians of their danger. The Greek commander, Miltiades, hastily mustered all his available men and dispatched a fast runner to Sparta, requesting assistance.
You would want to invade. Nobody in their right mind would want to invade Sparta. But there's nothing left there now, because they didn't build anything. There's just a little rock where they used to whip and toughen their youth. That's all that's left of Sparta. But when you sit down there in the woods all around, and the olive groves, you feel that any moment you're going to see Pan. There's an amazing atmosphere. The whole war machine has disappeared.
The Spartans were noted warriors, but they were superstitious and unexpectedly announced that for religious reasons they could not possibly march until after the next full moon. This meant a delay of at least a week, during which time almost anything could happen. Almost their only help came from the tiny state of Plataea, which promptly sent several hundred volunteers. Effectively, Miltiades was on his own. Undaunted, he marched his whole force of some 10,000 hoplites down to the plain of Marathon.
The hoplites, of course, became the most famous military organizations of infantry in particular of the whole of this period. They trained their men by way of being free men, of course. This was a very important aspect.
The archetypal Greek hoplite was either a free citizen obliged by his state's laws to provide his own equipment and march in its defense whenever required, or else a mercenary soldier hired on a short-term contract. He was, in fact, the ancient equivalent of the medieval knight.
Before the mainland Greeks, and particularly the Athenians, fought the Persians, we're told that they were quite frightened of them. This was to change quite radically when they finally faced them. This was largely because Persian troops were lightly armed and depended for victory on archers and on cavalry. The Greek hoplite soldier was a very different animal.
Man for man, it's probably true that the Greek army was rather better than the Persian army, precisely because the Greek army was made up of hoplites who were all extremely well armed. It was necessary to have a bronze helmet to protect the head, a bronze breastplate to protect front and rear, in fact, a round shield held on the left arm, and also bronze leg guards. And for that reason, man for man, the Persian soldier was not likely to be able to defeat a Greek soldier, precisely because the Greek soldier was better defended.
battle tactics of the Greek and Persian wars were brutally direct. In addition to the semi-aristocratic hoplites, Greek armies included large numbers of silwai, or light infantry skirmishers, and their primary role was to open the battle by harassing the enemy, particularly on the flanks. Once the enemy was judged to have been sufficiently softened up by the skirmishers, the hoplites, normally massed in the center in solid phalanxes, would roll forward to engage the enemy.
Another advantage that the Greek soldier enjoyed over his Persian counterpart was precisely that the Greeks were extremely well used to fighting as a single unit. It was not just one soldier fighting against another opposing soldier. The Athenian and the Spartan and all the other hoplites were trained in order to ensure that they defended their fellows with their shields. They did not use their spears in order to throw, but they used their spears as pikes, rather like medieval pikes, in order to maintain cohesion as a fighting force, and the whole line of the soldiers would defend each other, and in that way it was extremely difficult to break through a line of hoplites. There was not just a line at the front, there were a number of differing lines at the back, and shoving was a major part of a hoplite battle. It's the word that the Greeks use, othismos, a shove.
When one side or the other went down, the victors would draw their swords and hack at their now defenseless opponents as they lay on the ground or tried to escape. In contrast to the Greeks, the Persians had very few heavy infantry. Most of their infantry were archers, and they relied instead on a large body of cavalry. It was this factor which influenced their decision to stand and fight the Greeks on the plain of Marathon, rather than immediately forcing a passage through the mountains to Athens. They felt that time was on their side, and with the Athenian army effectively pinned down before them, there was every hope that Hippias's supporters in Athens might take the opportunity to revolt and seize the city behind the backs of the small Athenian army. For 5 days, the two armies faced each other, waiting for something to happen. And then on the night of the 11th of August, Datis re-embarked most of the Persian cavalry and slipped away, intending to land much closer to Athens at Phaleron Bay. The situation was now desperate. As soon as they realized what was happening, the Greeks were faced with a dilemma. Should they disengage at once and race northwards to save the city? To do so would mean leaving the mountain passes unguarded at their backs. Or should they at once attack Artaphernes and the Persian infantry? It was now dawn. Miltiades decided to take the risk that he could destroy the Persians now. The Athenian army moved forward to engage the Persian infantry. This was to be the famous battle of Marathon. His plan was the reverse of the usual Greek tactics. His center was deliberately weakened by widening the intervals between each file and reducing the depth of his phalanxes from the customary 8 men to only 4. His main strength was instead concentrated on the flanks, in the hope that he might thus be able to envelop the Persian flanks. On the other side of the plain, the Persians were deployed exactly as Miltiades had anticipated. Expecting the usual heavy attack in the center, Artaphernes had massed his best troops there, leaving his flanks to be guarded only by a fairly ineffective rabble of skirmishers. Nevertheless, the Athenian general was still taking a big risk. If the Persian archers inflicted too many casualties on the phalanxes, it could all end in disaster. With the rudimentary control over the men exercised by the Greek generals, once the heat of battle arose, even the simplest of plans could prove difficult to execute.
Athenian generals were appointed in a way which would be thought of as extremely odd in the modern world. In the modern world, we appoint generals. We have boards of appointment and governments who appoint generals. In the ancient world, however, an entirely standard pattern was for the whole citizen body to elect the people who would lead them in battle. And if you think about it, that's not a bad way of doing it. What a general had to do was essentially nothing very much. He had to give a good speech before the battle in order to put morale into his troops. He occasionally had to choose the battlefield, and that certainly happened during the Persian Wars, but once he'd chosen the battlefield, all the work was done not by the general, but by the troops themselves.
As soon as his men were deployed, Miltiades opened the attack, taking his men forward at a brisk trot in order to minimize the casualties from the archers. As anticipated, the Persian center put up a strong resistance and soon forced back the Athenian hoplites. But on the flanks, the Persians gave way. The lightly equipped archers were no match for the heavy phalanxes of hoplites and were soon utterly routed. Keeping his men well in hand, Miltiades left the pursuit to his own skirmishers and turned on the Persian center. Hemmed in on three sides, with a great salt marsh to their backs, Artaphernes and his men fought their way back, step by bloody step. The Athenian skirmishers had already worked their way behind them, blocking the narrow passage between the marsh and the sea, cutting the Persians off from their ships. Hundreds perished here or in the great marsh, but Artaphernes' own contingent kept their heads and fought their way straight down onto the beach, where they were eventually lifted off by their ships. The delivery of the news of the great victory was to have everlasting consequences.
And the battle went on for hours, but nevertheless the citizens of Athens couldn't see it, and they feared the worst. And the hours passed, and then from the walls of the city, the people looked out, and they saw a lone figure running, 27 miles from the plain of Marathon. The Marathon is based on it. And this man ran and ran and ran in the heat with his bits of armour on, covered in blood. And he came through the gates, and there was the government in front of him. There was the whole government of the people, and he was completely finished and done. And they looked at him and he said, "Victory." And he died. And the Athenians had defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon.
The Greeks had won the battle and afterwards made the inflated claims as to the numbers of enemy dead, customary in ancient times. But the fact remained that they had only defeated and not destroyed the Persians. Now they had to march and block the threatened landing at Phaleron. By the time they had done that, they would surely be too exhausted to face the Persian cavalry in a stand-up fight. They therefore had to reach the bay in time to meet the Persians as they landed on the beach. And as the military saying, familiar to generals down the ages goes, "Catch 'em with their feet wet." By a miraculous march, the Athenians succeeded in doing so, but only just. Unfortunately for the Persians, when they did arrive, they were so battered and demoralized by their earlier defeat and the march to the new battle site that they were quite incapable of establishing a beachhead. Datis reluctantly ordered a strategic withdrawal back across the Aegean. Greece had been saved. There was to be no respite for the beaten Persians. The Greeks promptly responded by launching a counteroffensive aimed at regaining control of the Aegean islands. Taking the war to the Persians, even in their beaten state, was beyond the limited resources of the Greeks. And within a very few years, they were facing a renewed Persian attack, this time led by Darius' son.
His name was Xerxes, and he was the king of Persia. Darius had died, and Xerxes wanted revenge. He actually saw himself as a kind of god, actually above the gods, certainly above the Greek gods. And he lived in colossi. Everything about him was colossal. He had black hair, about 35, dark, of course, swarthy, a thin kind of beard, dark, malignant eyes, and plaited hair. And he looked on at Greece with envy and wanted revenge. And he started to mount the most formidable army probably ever mounted on God's earth.
His army was undoubtedly huge by the standards of the day. Only about half of them were actually Persians. The rest were drawn from all over the Middle East and Asia Minor, and as usual included contingents of Greek mercenaries who fought for any master who could pay the price.
As the great armies of the Persians advanced, the people of Thessaly realized that unless they had considerable help from the Athenians and the Spartans from further south, they had no chance of resisting the Persians. And they sent messages to the Spartans to say, "Come and help us, or we will join the Persians, for otherwise we cannot survive." And the same was true of most of the people of Boeotia. It was only when the Persians reached Attica and reached the approaches to the Peloponnese that they found communities who were prepared to resist them and did not immediately join them out of their best interest.
It was because of the need for a common line that the Spartans, the Athenians, and most of the states of southern Greece set up the Hellenic League in the autumn of 481. There was to be a common council, but the naval and military command was to go to the Spartans. Now, given the fact that the bulk of the Allied fleet was made up of Athenian ships, this was quite surprising. But the Athenians, crucially, were willing to swallow their pride on this point. One of the first actions of the Hellenic League was to issue a proclamation that they would confiscate the land of any Greek state that surrendered to the Persians without a fight. And this seems to have had the required effect, as states like Boeotia, that initially leaned towards the Persians, came back towards the Greek side.
The mighty army of Xerxes was intended to force the complete subjugation of Greece once and for all. By the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes had crossed the Hellespont, that narrow stretch of water which separates Europe from Asia, and was pushing southwards into Thessaly. The Greeks, as usual, were divided among themselves. The Spartans argued that central Greece was indefensible and that they should fall back to defend the Isthmus of Corinth. This idea was, of course, deeply unpopular with those Greeks who lived north of the Isthmus, and in particular the Athenians. They argued that the sacrifice of northern and central Greece would be pointless, since there was nothing to prevent the Persians from effecting an amphibious landing south of the Isthmus. All the same, it was recognized that Thessaly was impossible to defend, and so the Greeks decided to make their famous stand at Thermopylae. It was a strong position in a pass, or rather a series of passes, between the mountains and the sea, the so-called West Gate, the Middle Gate, or Thermopylae itself, and finally, the East Gate. Leonidas, king of the Spartans, had been chosen to lead the Greek forces, and as Xerxes approached, he occupied the Middle Gate. This was an ideal defensive position, perhaps no more than 4 meters wide, but up in the mountains, another track led directly from the plain of Malea to the East Gate, behind Leonidas's position.
Just think of these Spartans, these 300 Spartans, like the SAS, the crack troops, the Marines. And there they were with 7,000 others to help them, the Thebans and the Thespians and the Arcadians and Phocians. And there they were, to face them. And they started washing their hair in the streams, the Spartans, because they were disciplinarians, and they got themselves ready, got their armour ready, a small amount of armour, and their short spear, and their short sword, and their long spear, and their shield, their magnificent shield. And Xerxes arrived with his chariots and his artillery, and his cavalry. And he looked on, surprised, because everybody had gone, "Oh, please, surrender, surrender." And he sent messengers. What are they doing here? He was astonished. Washing their hair in front of him, washing their hair in front of this great, marvellous army. He sent messengers and told them to part, to move, to retreat. And the Spartans just didn't move. And then he sent some more messengers, Xerxes, and he said, "Tell the Spartans that if they don't retreat, I will blot out the sun's rays with my arrows." And the Spartans replied, "Good, good, good. We like shade from the sun. It helps us fight better."
At first, all went according to plan. Xerxes halted in the plain of Mallia and waited for his supply ships to catch up. Then, after 4 days, he moved forward again, launching a probing attack against the Greek position in the middle gate. It very soon became obvious that the Greeks had picked their ground well. The Persian cavalry could not operate in the pass, and Xerxes' infantry were too lightly equipped to make any impression on the heavily armed hoplites. A second attack on the following day proved equally unsuccessful, but then the fortunes of war deserted the Greeks. Xerxes learned of the mountain track leading to the east gate. By using this, his men were able to outflank the small band of Greek heroes. In the bitter aftermath of defeat, the Greeks learned the awful truth. Leonidas had, in fact, been betrayed by a traitor named Ephialtes, who showed the Persians the way for a purse of gold. Fearful of being surrounded, most of the Greeks abandoned their position at Thermopylae and fled through the east gate, just ahead of the Persians. Not all of them made it, however, and both the Thebans and the Spartans were cut off.
The Spartans, when they fought the Battle of Thermopylae, knew that they were going to die because their purpose was to hold up the Persians for as long as they possibly could, but they knew that in the end that the Persians were going to get through. So since they knew that they were going to die, we are told by Herodotus, they combed their long hair before the battle to ensure that they looked right when they died. It's rather like wearing clean underpants just in case you have an accident. And another feature of Thermopylae is that the Spartans, since they knew they were going to die, they knew also that they were going to be disgraced in the sense that their bodies would be left on the battlefield for the Persians to be masters of in the end. They knew that they were going to die. Nonetheless, they were prepared to do their duty for Greece and in particular for Sparta, defend themselves in order to ensure that the Persians got through as slowly as possible.
Most of Leonidas's army could retreat, and they did. Mainly the Thebans and the Thespians and Arcadians, and they all went and just left the 300. And the 300 were now surrounded, and they fought on both sides, and they fought and they fought and they fought, and they lost their shields and they lost their helmets. And then the cry went up, "Leonidas is dead, Leonidas is dead." And they fought, it is said, always said by shepherds watching on the mountainside. They fought till they were almost naked with broken spears. And then Xerxes gave his order, and the arrows were fired, and they blotted out the sun, and the remainder of the Spartans were killed. You know something? I was there, alone, at Thermopylae in 1963. It was the afternoon, the sun was setting, the sea's not there, it's marshy now to my right, and the rocks are there. And there's a plaque on the floor where the Spartans died, and I was alone. And it said, "Stranger, here lie the Spartans, ready for your command." My hair stood on end. They were still down there. Their bones were down there.
The whole of Greece now lay open to the Persians, and after a short resistance, Athens was plundered and burned. Having abandoned their city before the Persians arrived, the Athenian army took refuge on the nearby island of Salamis. What was left of the Greek army hastily fortified the Isthmus of Corinth, after all, in a last-ditch attempt to keep the Persians out of the Peloponnesus. The last major weapon in the Greek arsenal was the strong Athenian navy, but Xerxes too had amassed a huge fleet.
When the pass of Thermopylae had fallen in the north of Greece, the next obvious line of defence was the Isthmus of Corinth. Now this was fine for the Spartans, but was rather problematical for the Athenians, given that Athens lay to the north of the Isthmus and could be occupied by the Persians, which it duly was, with the population being evacuated. Worse followed. There was moves among the Greek allies to remove not just the army, but also the allied fleet to a line south of the Isthmus. Given the nature of the opposing fleets, this was naval madness, and the Athenians, under their commander Themistocles, moved to do something against it.
Both sides knew that the outcome of the war would depend on the coming battle between the Greek and Persian navies. The battle which was to decide the war took place near Athens, in the narrow channel between the mainland and the island of Salamis.
The Athenian navy, in a real sense, was the lifeline for Athens, both in a military sense and in many others. Back in 480, the Athenians needed a navy to defend themselves against the Persian aggression, and so they built a navy from the proceeds of a silver mine that they had recently discovered in the southern part of their territory. And after the great success that the Athenians won in the Battle of Salamis in particular against the Persians, they exploited that navy for their own advantage in order to ensure the increase of their power within the Greek world.
The Greek navy at first lay off the north coast of the island in the Bay of Eleusis. The Persians lay to the south of them, off the long, narrow promontory of Cynosura. Xerxes was at first inclined to ignore the Greek ships, while his engineers began work on a massive series of causeways spanning the channel at its narrowest point. His engineers had already spanned the mighty Hellespont with pontoon bridges to carry the army across from Asia to Europe. Bridging the Salamis channel so that his army could reach the remnants of the Athenian army would be child's play by comparison. Well aware of this danger, the Greek admiral Themistocles set about luring the Persians into a trap. First, he had a message passed to Xerxes, claiming that he wanted to change sides. And by way of demonstrating his good faith, he warned the king that the Greeks intended to break out of the western end of the bay that night. Thinking that his moment had come, Xerxes ordered an immediate attack. Satisfied that the Persians were being drawn into the channel, Themistocles formed his line of battle and gave the signal to move forward and meet them. Xerxes had posted his experienced Phoenicians on his right, while the left was entrusted to his equally skillful Ionian contingent.
The Phoenicians and the Ionians were essentially two naval subject peoples of the Persians who provided Persian fleets. The Phoenicians were a major feature of the early naval activity in the eastern Mediterranean. They had been conquered by the Persians in the 6th century, and so the Persians had control of their fleet. The Ionians, though the name might not tell this to you, were in fact Greeks. They were Greeks who lived on the coast of Asia Minor, Greek cities founded way back in the 10th, 11th centuries, and who had, just like the Phoenicians, been conquered by the Persians, and so they provided the most effective military arm that they were capable of providing in order to ensure that the Persians could mount an effective invasion of Greece. And this gives us an indication that Greece was not a single city, Greece was not a single country, it was made up of lots of different cities, and it was perfectly reasonable for the Ionian Greeks, subject to the Persians, to fight against the mainland Greeks, who were not subject to the Persians. It's a standard feature of Greek life that cities differ from each other, cities are different. So Ionian Greeks are perfectly willing to fight against mainland Greeks in order to bring them under the control of their Persian masters.
After the crushing of the revolt which began the war, the Ionians had once again an acknowledged Persian overlordship, so that now Greek would fight Greek. As they moved deeper into the channel, the Persians began to run into difficulty. The channel narrowed dramatically, so that fewer than 20 triremes could draw up abreast. Already, half the Persian squadrons had been pulled out of the front line because there was no room for them. Now, a change in the weather made the problem even worse. Thus far, both sides had been moving in a flat calm, but now the wind rose sufficiently to create a significant swell. The slow, sleek Greek triremes rode it well, but the Phoenician ships stood much higher in the water and carried a much larger complement of men. In a straightforward stand-up fight, the Phoenicians may have enjoyed an advantage, but in the confined space of the channel, they had great difficulty in keeping station and soon began to run foul of each other. This was the moment the Greeks had been waiting for, and their triremes leapt forward through the water. At first, the Persian center held, and the Ionian Greeks put up a surprisingly spirited fight. But the Phoenicians were soon in trouble and began backing off. As more ships were still coming up behind them, the confusion only increased, and in the end, many of the Phoenician vessels took the easy way out and ran themselves aground. Understandably dismayed by this unexpected reverse, the Persian center gave way, and soon only the Ionians were still fighting, and by all accounts, fighting hard. Gallant though their struggle was, they could not turn the tide of battle alone, and soon they too gave up the unequal fight and fled back down the channel. Persian losses in the battle are unknown, though they were probably much less than the 200 ships claimed by the Greek historian Herodotus. Nevertheless, it was by any standards a decisive victory, and with half his navy destroyed, Xerxes was in no condition to renew the fight. Indeed, without an effective navy, it would be impossible to invade the Peloponnese. Reluctantly, Xerxes ordered a withdrawal back to the Hellespont. The general consensus was that it was better to allow the Persians to escape than to trap a starving and increasingly desperate army on Greek soil. It was to prove a disastrous decision. Xerxes, on the other hand, was understandably anxious to minimize the effects of his defeat. A complete withdrawal from Greece might well inspire renewed revolts, and so a substantial part of his army was left in Thessaly under a general named Mardonius, with instructions to renew the offensive if at all possible. Most of the forces left behind were in fact Greek, but Mardonius was also left with a substantial detachment of immortals.
The supply of the Persian army must have been a formidable problem. The highest estimate of the number of men that Xerxes had with him that we have from antiquity is in the region of 5 million. Now this is totally unbelievable, but a figure in the hundreds of thousands is believable. And at a time when the largest Greek city-state might have had a population of 50,000 men, women and children, feeding several 100,000 men on the march would be a very serious problem indeed. Xerxes seems to have tried to have solved this problem in 3 ways. First of all, he improved the infrastructure of the route he was taking into Greece. Famously, he built 2 bridges of boats across the Hellespont. He dug a canal through the promontory of Mount Athos in northern Greece, and he left a series of roads in places like Thrace that were to inspire awe 50 years later. Secondly, he picked his time to attack. He moved into northern Greece in the summer at a time where his own troops would be able to use the crops that would be ripening in the fields. The third mechanism used to alleviate the food supply problem was to divide the army into 3 groups that would provision themselves separately as they moved south. Even so, food supply must have remained a grave problem, especially after the loss of so much of the Persian fleet at Salamis. And it's no surprise that the Persian army that remained in Greece after Salamis was considerably smaller than the one that Xerxes had marched into Greece with.
Nothing if not enterprising, Mardonius extended his brief, promptly moved south, and mounted a raid on Athens. In this, he was spectacularly successful. His troops burnt the newly rebuilt city. He then retired at a leisurely pace into the plains of Boeotia, and waited for them to come looking for him. The Athenians and Spartans duly marched north under the command of a Spartan general named Pausanias, and found the Persians camped at Plataea. Here was to be the site of the last great encounter. Mardonius opened the battle with a cavalry charge against the Greek phalanxes. The Greeks were still at this stage on high ground overlooking the plain, and beat off the Persians without too much trouble. But just as Mardonius anticipated, they followed up the retreating cavalrymen and moved out onto the open plain. A stalemate now ensued. Although his cavalry could now be used more effectively, Mardonius was reluctant to tackle the hoplite phalanxes head-on, while, for their part, the Greeks were equally reluctant to advance further into the plain. For a week, both sides engaged in minor skirmishes, and gradually the Persians gained the upper hand. Their cavalry launched raids deep behind the Greek lines, cutting their supplies, while on the plain itself, Mardonius's men gradually forced the Greeks away from their water supply. At length, the Spartan commander, Pausanias, ordered the withdrawal under cover of darkness. But by now, the volatile Greek allies were bickering among themselves, and the withdrawal almost turned into disaster. But from that near disaster sprang the seeds of victory.
Even after Salamis, the Greeks still had problems. The Persians, after all, had been defeated by sea, but not on land, and this meant that they were still able to occupy Athens at will. In the winter of 480-479, it seems as if at least one group within Athens was willing to consider the possibility of coming to some arrangement with the Persians and leaving the Hellenic League. The fact that the Spartans moved their land army north of the Isthmus of Corinth in 479 to attack the Persians at Plataea in Boeotia was at least in part because of the possibility of such a defection. So it's fair to say then that whilst unity was one of the most important reasons for Greek victory, the possibility of disunity was one of the major forming factors of the Greek strategy of the war.
Feeling he could not lose against the much reduced Greek force, Mardonius immediately sent the Boeotians to engage the Athenians and keep them pinned down while he mobilized his full strength against the Spartans. But by sheer courage, the Greeks held out. The small army was not to be moved. A bitter struggle then followed in which the Spartans managed to stabilize their position with a counterattack. Meanwhile, by a supreme effort, the Athenians managed to rout the Boeotians and pursue them into the Persian camp. At this point, Mardonius himself was killed. At his death, his men lost heart and gave way. As a result of this great victory at Plataea in 479 BC, the Greeks were finally able to expel the Persians from Thessaly. Greece was saved.
It was an astonishing time. Leonidas did save us. We wouldn't have had the philosophers, we wouldn't have had democracy, we wouldn't have had all those writers, we wouldn't have had all those philosophies, those sciences, Pythagoras, everybody, Pindar, Aeschylus, Socrates, Sophocles, you name it. All those ideals we've got today, everything is based on the Greeks. And he saved it. He did it. And he held them back.
But the Persian Wars did not end there. For many years afterwards, troops loyal to the Persian Empire held out in Thrace. Again, disunity among the Greek states prolonged the war, and instead of final victory, within a few short years, Greece was to descend into the anarchy of the Peloponnesian civil wars.
Greece, and particularly Athens, was devastated. Previously, Athens and the temples there were largely built of wood, and of course they've been put to the fire and to sword. And so Athens rises like a phoenix from the ashes, if you like, in the middle of the 5th century. And this is the great period. This is what we see now when we look at the Acropolis. You raise your eyes up and you see the Parthenon there, the great temple to the goddess Athena, the Athens of democracy that we know today.
Not for 100 years would Greek soldiers be able to march out for a final reckoning with Persia. But that day would finally come, and when they did, they would be led by one of the greatest soldiers of all time, Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great. But that's another story.